Hello, and welcome to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're going to be sharing tips for the exam countdown, these last few weeks before final exams. Your Law School Toolbox hosts are Allison Monahan and Lee Burgess. That's me. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, the Catapult Conference, and the Trebuchet Legal Careers site. Allison also runs the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review on iTunes. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started.
Counting the time to their first exam in weeks rather than months, lots of law students start to panic. While we definitely don't suggest panicking, some concern is warranted. Time is going to go quickly, and you want to make sure you're using it wisely in the last month or so until exams start. So, Lee, let's talk about some strategies for maximizing these last few weeks before exams. What's most critical, do you think, to keep in mind during the last month or so of classes before the exam period really starts in earnest?
Gosh, I think the hardest thing about these last few weeks is really time management. You made
Definitely.
Yeah, you made the point that it starts to go by quickly, and I think that's absolutely the case. But people feel like there's just like this train coming towards them in the tunnel.
It does, right?
But you can't just, you don't want to feel out of control. You need to figure out how you can manage your time and get the most from these last few weeks, because there's a lot of work to be done, but there's a lot of time to get a lot of stuff done.
Right. I think if you're focused and you're efficient, there is a lot of time, but it's also easy to sort of while away the time that you have available thinking like, oh, I'll get started on that next week, or, oh yeah, I'm a little behind, I'll start my outlining soon. And, that can be deadly because pretty soon becomes never. And then you're in this situation of like absolute panic where it's like, oh my gosh, it's like the day before Thanksgiving. I haven't even started like making sense of any of this material. My first exam is in a week or two. What am I going to do? And then it's just like complete meltdown mode, which doesn't really help anyone.
Absolutely. And I think the best thing you can do to kind of avoid this from happening is to immediately create a study calendar for these last few weeks. So you really have an idea of what you're going to do with your time and what needs to get done. And shockingly enough, when I recommend to students that they do this, the first thing I ask is to like write down when their exams are. And some folks still don't know what days their exams are.
Yeah, I feel like this vague idea, like, oh, I think they start in like the middle of December. It's like, no. Or how much time do you have between them? When is the first one? Do you have 2 days between your first two exams? Do you have a week between them? That's a totally different scenario. So yeah, I think absolutely this idea of creating a study calendar for the rest of the semester is absolutely critical. And you have to back it out from your exams, right? I mean, if you have 3 or 4 exams, the first thing you need to do is put those exams on your study calendar. Make sure you know what time of day they are. Mm-hmm. Are they in the morning? Are they in the afternoon? Triple check this information.
Yes.
Because what's the easiest way to guarantee you're going to fail your class? Not to show up for the exam on time.
Absolutely. And I think going hand in hand with that is you need to double check with yourself that you know what type of exam those are going to be. Because I think also at this point, if you don't know what the format of that exam is going to be, that's also incredibly problematic. Your professor should have either put it in the syllabus, talked about it in class. If nobody in your class knows what's on the exam, then it's time to go to office hours and ask.
Or time to ask that question in class so everyone gets the same information about, what you're allowed to bring or not bring, what the format is.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. If you don't know that you're having a multiple choice test, you should know that by now.
Exactly. Because that's going to somewhat influence how you study.
Or if you don't know if your test is open book or closed book, or if it's open book, are you allowed to bring anything? Are you only allowed to bring one page? Like, these are really critical pieces of information.
Yeah. So based on that information is really how I think you identify what the tasks are that needs to be done. And I think for all of your classes, you need to create some sort of outline.
Or something.
Flow charts or some sort of study materials.
Something to make sense of the material.
Exactly. But, depending on the type of exam, those documents or whatever you end up making them, they vary. So you definitely want to think about, what you want to create for some of these classes and when you're going to do them. And please don't leave this outlining exercise to the last minute. It is not productive.
No, and when we talk about, making outlines or study aids or something, this is not something you can do in, the 20 minutes between classes. Typically, This is the sort of deep work that we've talked about before, where you're going to have to block out 3 or 4 hour periods over a consistent period of time. And if you're looking at your first exam is, less than, say, 4 or 5 weeks away, you don't have a lot of time left. You've got a few weekends, and you're going to you should be expecting to work more or less all of those weekends, at least part of the day. You probably need to be doing a session of outlining on Saturday and another one on Sunday. And each of those is probably going to be 3 or 4 hours. And this is, of course, on top of your legal writing assignments that are come due, and also, continuing to be prepared and go to class. So there's a lot of stuff that people really have to get serious about.
And I think one of the things that students do first is they throw the reading and the class preparation out the window.
Right. I'll skip class.
I'll skip class. And this is a huge mistake. You may have to put constraints on how much time that you spend preparing for class. Maybe you can't read, 3 or 4 supplements before class, which you shouldn't be doing anyway. But professors often really heavily test what is at the end of the semester to punish people who have stopped studying at the end of the semester.
Right. Well, it also just makes sense because this is the time that your professor is writing your exam. And they're thinking about if I want to include this question, we've got to cover this material.
Yep.
And I remember my first semester of law school, my contracts class, we had a double session the last day of class to make up for the fact that we had not had whatever, we'd missed a class or whatever. And the bulk of the exam was out of that second makeup session.
Oh, that's so unnerving.
And it was because she had written an exam question and she had to cover that material.
Yeah. I think a lot of students also in torts classes, which is almost everyone takes first semester, professors like to do products liability at the end of the semester.
We did that. It was our last day.
Me too.
Totally, absolutely on the exam.
Always on the exam. And products is really pretty complicated. And so
it's not easy.
It's not easy. And so students wait till the last minute to outline it, and then they don't understand the material, and then they don't want to practice it because they don't understand it. And it's almost always on the exam because it gets the curve. So you cannot...
And my torts professor had written law review articles on product liability. Everyone knew this was going to be on the test. He covered it the last day. And I remember sitting in the architecture library at Columbia studying, reading his law review article or whatever. And I was just like, oh my God, I have absolutely no idea what is going on right now. And I'm almost certain this is going to be on the exam. And it was.
Yeah. So you can't just start ignoring class, and please don't stop going. Even if for some reason you decide to stop doing your reading, still go to class. Don't stop going to class.
Go and take copious notes.
I also think you need to keep up with how you're doing each week. I think one of the things that happens when you create these study schedules is they might seem all fine and good. Say you've got your printed out calendar and you've assigned a couple classes a week that you're going to focus on, and you've set aside your time for outlining, and then the first week goes by and you get sick. And so you only do half of the things kind of on your list that you were going to accomplish that week. It is not time to throw out the study schedule.
Right. And also, I think another thing people underestimate drastically is just the amount of time that's required to do these things. So, if you say you haven't done any outlining, in your torts class for the whole semester, and you block out a 3-hour block to do your outline for the whole semester, and you're in November, that is not realistic.
Right.
So you've really got to be tracking, okay, I thought I was going to get through these topics or this much of the class, and actually I got through a quarter of that. Mm-hmm. How does that impact what I'm doing for the rest of this time? It's got to be this moving document, because you're much better off having an outline that covers every topic, even if it's not in every single detail, than you are having an outline that's really great for half the class and doesn't exist for the other half.
Yeah, I think that's 100% right. And so this idea of this living, breathing study schedule that you continue to check in on and change, as you go on is very important, whether it's miscalculating how much time something's going to take, or if you get sick and you have to take a day or two off, there's no getting behind necessarily. It's just readjusting, because if you start to get in that mindset of like, well, I'm behind, I should just throw the whole thing out the window. That is not,
give up.
As you give up, that is not the way to do it. So you need to keep forging ahead.
And the reality is sometimes you just have to force yourself to move on. So if you find that you're still in the first 2 weeks of the semester and you've been working on your outline for 8 hours, you have to move on.
Yeah.
Like there's no other choice.
Yep. And what I was just I think that students also underestimate the time that some of these legal writing final exams will take. And that usually happens sometime in November. Mm-hmm. And different schools do it different ways. But not only can it take a lot of time, they can be pretty exhausting. And I think people, need to be realistic that even after you turn in one of these things, you're not going to walk to the library and then do some really high quality studying.
No, I mean, exactly. And the same thing when you're looking at your exam schedule. If you're like, oh, no problem, I have a day between, one of my exams is on Monday and one's on Tuesday, no problem, I'll just study for the Tuesday one after I take the Monday one. Like, no, that's not productive study time.
No, because you're burned out and you have to give yourself time. Yeah, you have to give yourself time to recover. So that's the other thing I think to think about in the study schedule is remember that this is not something that needs to happen where you're studying, till 11 o'clock at night every night. You absolutely need to sleep and take care of yourself, because worse than getting behind is getting really, really sick or burned out and not being able to work productively. So you have to take care of yourself, eat well, continue to exercise, get outside as much as you can to keep things moving and be productive.
Yeah, and all these things should be on your study calendar as well.
Yes, very good point.
You're much more likely to make that yoga class or go to that cycling class or take a run if you actually put it on your calendar. And again, if you didn't do it, if you plan to do 3 days of exercise a week because you know that that's what you need so you don't go stir crazy and get sick and go, just be really unhappy, you can tell oh, you know what? I noticed for the last week I haven't gone to the gym. Mm-hmm. How is that impacting me? Maybe I need to make that a bigger priority.
For sure. I think that's 100% right. And then I think the other thing people underestimate is possibly trying to travel for the holidays.
Oh God, Thanksgiving. It's Thanksgiving, it's just the worst. It's the worst possible timing for having a guilt-ridden family Thanksgiving, or not having, having a non-family Thanksgiving that's guilt-ridden. It's just, and it's always right there. It's that's when you're oh my God, my exams start in a week and a half.
Yeah, exactly. So you've got to really think about whether or not it's practical and a good idea to travel and spend time with your family. Because you do still need to study. I mean, I think you can take Thanksgiving Day off, but you can't just say, oh, I'm going to take a 4-day weekend, I'll be fine. I'll take
a 5-day holiday. I'm going to fly in possibly bad weather.
Right.
To each his own, but I think you probably need to have some serious conversations with, the people in your life about what makes sense for you to do this particular year.
Yeah, and I think this year even more than future years, because your final exam schedule of your first year is going to be so much more exam heavy likely than future years. You might have papers or other things that may make things a little bit more flexible, but if you've got to come back and really knock some exams out of the park, then you just need to make sure that Thanksgiving is not the reason why you don't perform well when you get back.
Right. And I think it's difficult because, there are typically people have expectations about what they want you to do. And, we all want to honor other people's ideas about what we should do to the extent that we can. However, you also have to advocate for yourself and say, look, I'm in law school. It's my first semester, probably. If you're listening to this, I'm spending a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of energy, and everything is riding on these next few weeks.
Mm-hmm. And I think it just is hard, especially if you don't have lawyers in your family. I mean, my parents were lawyers, so it was never a huge issue. And I could drive home. I didn't go to school very far away from where I was from, so that was also not a huge issue. But for folks who don't have lawyers in their family, who don't really remember what it was like, you need to really have a thoughtful conversation with loved ones so they can start to understand the kind of pressure you're under.
Yeah, I mean, I was in school in New York, and I was you've got to be joking. There's no way I'm getting on a plane to fly anywhere. At the time I was living in California, I'm going to fly across the country 3,000 miles to have Thanksgiving dinner and fly back. I was this seems crazy.
Yeah.
So, I ended up going on the train with my roommate who lived in Philadelphia, and we hung out with her parents for a couple of days. And it was actually like a pretty nice break, but we did a lot of studying. I remember Thanksgiving morning, we were studying while her mother was making her dinner. Very nice, very nice of her. And we're studying on the train, and we're studying on the way back. And, we did occasionally, like, we'd go out to dinner with her friends or whatever. But we definitely were not, it was not like a 5-day Thanksgiving break.
Right. And I think finding those pockets of time that you can study and setting those expectations with your loved ones, if it's like, okay, well, we have a big family thing the day after Thanksgiving, it's like, okay, well, I can come to that big family thing, but before that, I have to go to the library or somewhere to study.
Yeah, I remember in architecture school, I was the only person in the architecture building working on Thanksgiving Day, which was crazy. They didn't even have the heat on. It was insane. And my younger sister, who was studying at a college nearby, came up, and she literally was like, you have to at least take time off to go have Thanksgiving dinner. This is not healthy. And I was like, no, don't come. I'm too busy. And she's like, this is crazy. You can take 2 hours and go have dinner with me.
Well, the thing is, I think it's like only in California would they ever consider turning off the heat, though, because if you were back east.
Well, it was El Nino. It was freezing.
Oh, my God.
It had been raining for like weeks on end. It was so cold. It was horrible. It was like the worst Thanksgiving. And my sister was vegan, so we thank goodness we were in Berkeley because we could go have vegan Thanksgiving.
Yum.
Yeah, right. Yum. Woo.
Tofurkey or whatever. What is it called?
Yeah, it was like tofurkey.
All right. So outside of the holiday,
I think the last word on Thanksgiving. Basically, you just need to manage everyone's expectations, and have these conversations as far in advance as you can, and draw boundaries if you have to. Look out for you, basically.
Yeah, did you have any friends in law school who went home for Thanksgiving and then their significant other broke up with them? This was always talked about at my law school about why people shouldn't go home for Thanksgiving.
I mean, I can see it happening. I'm not aware of it happening. Anyway. But it is that time. I mean, that's the other thing. It's the life drama tends to pop up. So you might just want to go ahead and I've actually heard stories about people sort of telling their significant others, you can't break up with me for the next month. If you want to break up with me, that's fine. I'll live with it, but you just can't do it for the next month.
I think those conversations are had around the bar exam as well.
Yeah, it's just it's all good. We can talk about this later, but just cannot handle it right now.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. What about trying to figure out what your weaknesses are? I mean, I think a lot of students probably listening to this podcast may have had midterms. And I think midterms are one of those things that can really tell you how you need to study for these exams because you're going to get some feedback on what you're struggling with.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, students hate midterms a lot of the time. They freak out about them, but they're actually a really great study tool if used correctly because you have had, you've been through that experience of taking an exam. Hopefully you've gotten either personal feedback or, at a bare minimum, you have a sample answer, presumably, to work from, or your professors at least talked about it. You can really glean a lot from these materials. I think it's a question of really critically reviewing your own work, comparing it carefully to the sample answer, and not letting yourself off the hook, not being like, oh yeah, I basically got that, but really looking at where was what I wrote different? What did I miss? How did they phrase things differently? Was there a structure that their structure, the sample structure is better than what I used? And then talk to your professors and try to get feedback on it.
Yeah. I mean, I think your professors, if they're giving you a midterm, one of their goals is going to be so you can get some feedback. So there's no really other reason to give midterms in law school because it creates more work for them.
Right.
So they are only doing it, I think, to give you that benchmark. So utilize their availability, go to office hours, take your answer, or even better, rewrite your answer to try and remedy some of the problems and see if they'll take a look at it because it's hard to know if you're fixing the problem. So
yeah, absolutely. And we'll make a plug for tutoring here because that's one of the things that we really work with students on is send me the answer that you wrote for your midterm and we'll talk about how you could have done a better job. I'll actually help you rewrite it. We'll show you this is where you're doing what you need to be doing. This is a good argument. This is not a good argument. This argument, you're not using the facts here. It's vague, but here's a situation where you did use the facts and do more of that. So And you can compare notes with your friends, but they don't know what they're doing either. So
that could be it can end up going down a tough road there sometimes.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of students kind of ignore even feedback they might get from their legal writing professors as far as how that may relate to your final exams. But I think that's a mistake because in a way, legal writing is legal writing. If you're struggling with the IRAC formula, if you're struggling with legal analysis, you want to really appreciate all the feedback that you're getting, especially even from your legal writing classes, especially, when it comes to your legal writing final. Make sure that you're paying a lot of attention to that feedback as well.
Yeah, absolutely. In legal writing, your job is to give your professor what they're looking for, but you can also take their feedback and apply it in other realms. The idea of making a strong argument and supporting it, that's pretty universal in law school.
It is. And it was interesting. I was just on the phone with one of our tutors who is a former legal writing professor. And we were talking about kind of some of the pitfalls that students have with legal writing. And one of the things we were talking about is that students struggle with how to use cases, to beef up their arguments. And if you are one of those students who right now is saying, I don't really know how to do that, you want to go try and speak to your legal writing professor and clear that up, because on your final exam for your legal writing class, you'll absolutely need to have that skill. And really, for your essay exams, you may need to have that skill as well, too, if you are analyzing a set of fact patterns that's going to call to mind cases that you discussed in your class.
I think that's a great point. And I was talking with a student this morning, and she had actually had a sample midterm that she turned in and then sent to me for feedback. And I was like, well, okay, you're doing a good job identifying the arguments, but you're not actually analyzing them. How do you think this would come out? This is what we really do when we think like a lawyer. So having someone have that second eye where oh, I thought I got everything because I wrote down the arguments. It's well, yeah, you wrote down the arguments, but that's actually kind of only the first step.
Yep, exactly. So no matter what, if you had graded midterms or practice questions or whatever is floating around that is an example for you that you can do some practice and get some feedback on it, make the most of that feedback so you don't learn some of these lessons of what you struggle with on your final exam.
Yeah, and I think another great thing about midterms is it allows you to really check how your outlining and study aids are working, because this is the point where you really need to be triaging about what you are behind on. So if you haven't started outlining, that's a serious problem. If you're behind on your outlines, that's a problem. If you outlined for your midterm and you found out that actually didn't really help you, that's also a problem.
Right. If you sit down to take your first practice test and find out that your outline doesn't really help you do that, that's also a problem.
Yeah, or if you haven't taken any practice tests.
Oh, even worse. Yeah, even worse. And again, they don't have to be the full exam that your professor gave, but they need to be some sort of a fact pattern that's like what your professor's likely to give. You need to figure out whether or not you're studying to be able to, create that deliverable that they're asking you to do at the end of the semester.
Well, what about this idea that you don't know enough to take practice tests? Or you're not far enough along on your outlines to take a practice test?
That is absolutely untrue, because you know something. You may not be able to take a whole entire practice test, but you at this point have learned something. At this point in the semester, if you're listening to this podcast, it's likely, late October, November, or if you're listening to it in the future, unless you are in your first couple of weeks of class, you know something. So you can absolutely write an answer to some sort of a hypothetical. Maybe it's just the first paragraph of a fact pattern from one of their final exams, but that's still enough to trigger some issues and do some writing practice.
Right, and I think it's interesting. I mean, I was working with a student yesterday on a question, and, the question was analyze the situation under Statute A and Statute B. And these are pretty well-known statutes, federal statutes in this particular area of law. And his answer only talked about Statute B.
Oops.
And I was sort of do you have anything to say about A? And the student said, oh, well, I don't guess I really understand the difference between them. And it was okay, this is a great learning opportunity because you've taken a practice test. You have realized or not realized, but it's now been pointed out to you that you only did half the question, and you realize you don't actually know the difference. So what does that suggest? It suggests that the materials that you've made and studied so far are not working.
Yeah. And I think, we understand that forcing yourself to do this practice, especially early on, is really frustrating, hard stuff. I mean, this really will hit all the stress and anxiety buttons for you. You're going to feel overwhelmed. I mean, I remember my school actually proctored some practice exams in October for our first year classes. And on a Saturday, you could come in and take it in the classroom. It was kind of like a mock exam. And I remember sitting down for one was in civil procedure, and I was horribly behind. I was not outlining like I should be. And I just read the question and then literally closed my laptop and left. Like I didn't even try. I was like, I don't know what I'm supposed to write. I don't know what the law is. Like, I am so screwed. I am just going to walk out. And I did. I walked out, which is not the right thing to do. But,
wow. That's really out of character too.
I know. Well, the first semester of law school it brings out all sorts of interesting things for all of us, right? I did go back and eventually struggle with that question, but it was one of those things where I was like, I am not going to do this right now. I do not know enough. And I think you've got to sit down and say, like, I know this is going to be hard, but I'm going to do it anyway.
Yeah, I think you just have to force yourself to do it because, I mean, the reality is it gets easier and it gets easier pretty quickly, typically.
Yep.
I mean, even if you look at it, and it doesn't have to be that you're doing this under timed exam conditions, closed book exam in the beginning. It's fine if you let yourself, like, use your outline or whatever on the first test you take, because the point is not to exactly replicate conditions at this point. I mean, the day before your exam, probably you shouldn't be using your outline. But a month before is completely fine because that's how you learn.
Exactly. So, realize that it's going to be hard. It's going to make you nervous, but that's why it's worthwhile because you need
and it's
to
also
to
why
get through
a lot of people will not do it.
Yep. And so if you force yourself to do it and get something out of it, it's going to really help your place in the curve. We'll be honest.
Yeah, and I think at this point of triage, it's not about reading the cases. Like, yes, you should read the cases, but it's not about reading the cases 3 or 4 times. Like, what you need is not in the case law at this point.
Right.
What you need is more likely in a supplement, some sort of commercial outline, a horn book, which you combine with your class notes and all these things to make it your own. But you've got to have this overall sense of the law. And if you don't have that right now, it's time to get some commercial outlines, go to the library, read a horn book, maybe look through an old outline, although I don't usually think that's the best way to sort of triage on this because you need almost more of like a narrative. So it might be, reading a book like an examples and explanations or like the Charles Dean on contracts or Chemerinsky on con law, something that's going to give you the basic picture if you don't have that right now.
For sure. And this is another place where if you are really struggling triaging, utilize all the resources you have. So talking to professors, going to try and get an appointment with their academic support office if your school has something like that. Talking to your TAs about final exams in certain classes if you have TAs. Use your resources. Don't feel like you're out there struggling alone, and don't feel like that if you ask for help, there's something wrong with you. Struggling on your own without asking for help is the biggest mistake.
Yeah, well, what do you think about study groups at this point? This can be the point where people really start to turn to their study group for moral support and other support.
I think study groups can be good for moral support, and I think it really varies person to person and study group to study group, whether or not it's a good use of your time when you have limited time. So I have walked out of study groups around final exam time with basically saying like, hey guys, this is not getting me anywhere. I need to sit down and struggle with this material myself. And I think you have to sometimes make those decisions. Or study groups can also turn into just these panic machines where everybody starts feeding off of everybody else's anxiety. That's also not a good use of your time.
No.
Or they also start dividing up work, outlining different parts and things like that.
Right, everyone starts to realize I'm not actually going to finish my outlines. Is there a way I can offload some of this?
Yeah, no is the answer to that. Is not a good idea. So I think you have to be really thoughtful about your study group and whether or not you learn from your time spent with them, and is that going to get the best bang for your buck? If it's basically your options are, I'm going to spend 4 more hours with this study group where I might not get anything, or I might get some extra sleep at night, I would probably get more sleep.
Right. I think it really varies. I mean, I was never a huge fan of study groups. I didn't have an ongoing one. I would typically, as it got closer to exams, I would try to find 1 or 2 other people in a class. And we actually had different people in different sections. It wasn't all the same. So, it might be I'd study with these two people for one class and this person for the other class, and, just kind of mix it up a little bit. And there's nothing wrong with having a study group if you're using your time effectively. And some people find it very effective. They're really focused. They are doing the work, that needs to be done. And critically, they're making sure that they're individually ready to show up to that exam. Because, the reality is, your study group might know a lot more than you know on certain topics. That's not going to help you on the test.
Yeah. I've heard people say like, well, somebody who's at the top of my class is in my study group. And I'm like, I don't really care. Yeah, good for them. That might mean the study group is working great for them, but that doesn't necessarily mean the study group is working great for you.
Well, and I think it's easy too to sort of not really realize how much assistance you're getting in the moment from the group. I was thinking about this today in terms of my Spanish class, because I have a Spanish tutor, and he's just so used to correcting me and adding words and figuring out what I'm trying to talk about that, like, I can carry on a conversation with him. It's great. But if I go out and try to talk to someone who's just like, what the hell are you talking about? It's a whole different story. So, like, in your study group, it can be that someone's there prodding you or reminding you, or you're like, oh, you reach a point where you like can't quite remember, and someone immediately jumps in with that case, and you think you remember the case, but you don't.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Now, one thing I do think study groups can be good for is some accountability. So one thing that at different times I had groups of friends do is we'd all either agree to come to the library and either get a study room or meet in a certain place in the library and all take a practice exam, a timed practice exam, and then we might get together and kind of like talk through the sample answer and compare answers or something like that. And then everybody's made sure that we sat down and did it.
Right. And also and I think that's really useful because, someone else might spot an issue that you missed or vice versa. And so then you get the benefit of that collective wisdom because you can make notes on like, oh, I missed this. I don't want to miss it again.
Yeah. So that I think can be a good that I think is a good use of time, possibly with a study group, if you need that additional accountability. That way you make sure, okay, I do this practice exam this day because we're going to meet and talk about it tonight, things like that. I think that's can be a better use of time than just sitting around and shooting... just like
shooting the breeze.
Thank you. I was trying to think of the
PG level.
PG level word would be. You can tell I need to work on that now that my son's getting a little older. But but it's kind of like you need to make sure that you're not just talking about whatever, that you're actually using that time for something valuable.
Well, and also I think one pitfall is that people can get really obsessive about certain things, or like someone doesn't understand something. It's fine if someone doesn't understand something as long as when they explain, like someone else explains it, they're like, oh, okay. But sometimes because it's law school, people can get super argumentative about these really pedantic points that don't matter, and you just realize like I just wasted half an hour on this.
Yeah.
Like, this is not something that I need to be spending time on.
No. So. And especially, I think, for those of you who are going to have closed book exams, make sure that you remember that unless you can memorize while you're in a group of people, that you still need to set aside adequate time, even for open book exams, because you still have to memorize. But you really need to set aside adequate time for your own, study time so you can memorize and put this stuff in your own head that is hard to do in a group of people.
Yeah, I think even if you are like relying heavily on a study group, you still have to have that alone time to process.
Yeah.
You can't process a lot of information, in a group of 4 people. It's just not going to happen.
No. The other thing I think which is hard with study groups is, like we mentioned, the stress can get a little crazy and you can all start to feed into this anxiety machine. Actually, this is law school as a whole, the law library as a whole, where you start to just let your own stress level get off the charts and you start to feel like you have to study these crazy hours or be in the library till the end of the day, and that's not going to serve you well because you have to be very serious about stress and life management.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things to think about now is where are you going to study? Like, are you going to be in the law library? That might not be the best choice. Are you going to study at your house? Are you going to study in a different library? Are you going to study at a coffee shop? Like, what works best for you? And these are things to think about now. What time of day are you going to study best? Because, we're all different. Like, I study in a coffee shop sometimes, but other people, that would drive them crazy. And I hated the law library. So, you can do whatever you want. There's not going to be a checklist of like, where did you study on the exam? It's just like, is this in your own head? And can you get it out on paper when the time comes?
Yep. And sometimes being around other law students can just really send you off the end. So make sure that if you are not in a good place about being at school, don't go to school. Like, you don't have to be there. There's no reason.
You don't have to. You can do whatever you want. You're a grown up. You're allowed to study where you want.
Exactly. I studied at the medical school. It was a very nice, pleasant place to hang out.
No, I would study at Teachers College. I would study at the Architecture Building. I would study in the Social Work Library. And I would study at the top of the undergraduate library. I did not set foot in the law school if I could help it.
Sometimes I did, but it was really minimal. And if I did, I always had headphones, even if I wasn't listening to anything, because I don't actually like to study to music, but I would just put on headphones so people thought I was listening to something. It wouldn't bother me.
Yeah, and this is kind of goes on to the bigger point, which is you have to clear the decks here and do what works for you. You know, if your study group is not working for you, you need to be a grown up and say, look, this is not working for me. Or you don't even have to say that. You can just be like, you know what? There are other things I want to work on. I'm not going to meet with you today. Yeah. You're allowed to do that.
For sure. But it's very, very important to remember that this is a marathon and not a sprint. You cannot burn yourself out by studying 12, 14-hour days.
Or staying up all night.
Because it is not going to serve you when it comes to exam time. It's really important. Start working on these skills now. When you get to the bar exam, it's even more important because you study for a longer period of time. But this is like a really intense job. That's it.
Yeah, and you've got to actually schedule things like sleep and exercise and time off and stress reduction. And it's totally fine. Like, you should be scheduling time off. You know, you should be seeing the people in your life that you want to see within reason. You probably should not be planning major social events, weddings if you can help it. Those are another classic problem. Like, the day before my exam, I have to go to a wedding. It's like, really?
Yeah.
And like, just, whatever. If it's your sister, like, you go. But if it's, some friend you haven't talked to in 5 years from college, like, maybe you send them a nice present.
Right, exactly. Tell them you'll see them over the summer or over winter break or something like that. And I think you have to set aside time also to optimize your studying. For a lot of people, studying all day, it's not productive. It's not productive. And so I remember my first semester of law school, I used to go to this yoga class at like 2:00 in the afternoon. And one of the things they did was they go around the circle and everybody would talk about why they made the choice to come to yoga today. This is a very San Francisco thing. In like Haight-Ashbury, we all have to sit around and talk about why we're at yoga. And I would say, like, I'm in law school and I'm in final exams, and everyone would be this collective, like, I'm so sorry. Yes, I'm glad you came to yoga. But it's a very nice kind of therapeutic environment to go to, and they would be, with a lot of compassion.
When I was studying for the bar exam, I got an unlimited yoga pass, and I would sometimes go twice a day. And it was the sort of thing where people were like, you were here this morning. I'm like, I'm studying for the bar. They're like, oh, yes, namaste.
Totally. Another thing my friends used to do is at our school, there was... at our health center where they had the gym and everything, they would have these really discounted student massages that would be like $35 for an hour or something like that. And so a lot of the law students would go schedule massages at a discount. So, really like open your mind to different ways to de-stress when you're in the middle of this, because final exams last a really long time.
Yeah, you're going to be in this for weeks. And I think, getting a massage is actually a very good investment of time and money, because it relaxes you, it allows you to focus, and these are the things you need to be doing. So it's not like you're wasting time and money. It's an investment.
Yeah.
Well, unfortunately with that, we are out of time. Our last words to you: don't panic, but don't delude yourself either. It's important to be realistic and have a plan to succeed. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, we would really appreciate it if you could take a second to leave a rating or a review on iTunes. And you can subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any comments or questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at Lee or Allison at lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our contact website forum at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon. Good luck preparing for exams.